When the townspeople of Millfield decided to pair their most useless resident, a wheelchair-bound Civil War veteran, with a desperate pregnant widow as a cruel joke, they never expected Jacob Reeves to become the very thing that would save Catherine Crawford's life and future. In the harsh Kansas territory of 1867, two broken souls discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what you can do, but from choosing to do everything you can for someone who truly needs you. But when the town council arrives with papers to tear their newfound family apart, will Jacob's newfound purpose be enough to fight a system determined to keep broken things in their place? The wheelchair got stuck again. Jacob Reeves pushed harder against the wooden wheels, his arms burning as he tried to free himself from the deep rut in Millfield's main street. The Kansas sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, and sweat dripped into his eyes as he struggled. Behind him, he could hear the men from the Silver Dollar Saloon watching and whispering. "Look at him go," someone said with a laugh. "Like a turtle flipped on its back." Jacob's jaw clenched, but he kept pushing. 3 years had passed since the Battle of Gettysburg took his legs, and he still wasn't used to being the town's entertainment. The year was 1867, and Millfield, Kansas territory, was the kind of place where people had nothing better to do than watch a broken man fight with dirt and wooden wheels. Finally, the chair broke free, and Jacob rolled forward toward the general store. His hands were shaking again. They always did when he got frustrated or remembered too much about the war. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, nodded as Jacob entered, but his eyes looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure what to say to a man who used to walk tall and now sat low. "Afternoon, Jacob," Peterson said, wiping his hands on his apron. "What can I get for you today?" "Just some coffee beans and flour," Jacob replied, counting out his coins carefully. His army pension didn't stretch very far, and every penny mattered. "And maybe some of that hard candy if you have any left." Peterson gathered the items, stealing glances at Jacob's trembling hands. "You know, there's talk around town about you," he said quietly. "Some of the council members have been discussing opportunities for you to contribute more to the community." Jacob's stomach tightened. In his experience, when powerful men talked about opportunities for people like him, it usually meant trouble. "What kind of opportunities?" "Oh, nothing definite yet," Peterson said, but his tone suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Just talk about how everyone should do their part, you understand." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and coming storms. Jacob loaded his supplies into the saddlebags attached to his chair and began the slow journey home to his small cabin at the edge of town. The building had been a storage shed before the war, but now it was all he could afford. It sat alone on a patch of prairie grass, surrounded by nothing but endless sky and the sound of wind through the wheat. As he approached his cabin, Jacob noticed a rider coming toward town from the opposite direction. The horse moved slowly, and the rider sat hunched forward like someone carrying a heavy burden. It was a woman, he realized, and she looked like she was in trouble. Jacob changed direction, rolling his chair toward the approaching rider. As he got closer, he could see that the woman was young, maybe in her 20s, with brown hair that had escaped from its pins and a dress that was torn and dusty. Her face was pale, and she clutched the horse's reins with white knuckles. "Ma'am," Jacob called out, "are you all right?" The woman looked up at him, and he could see fear in her green eyes. She was breathing hard, and there was something about the way she held herself that made Jacob think of wounded animals he'd seen during the war, creatures that knew they were hurt but weren't sure who they could trust. "I'm looking for Millfield," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this the right way?" "Yes, ma'am. Just keep riding straight for another quarter mile, and you'll see the buildings." Jacob studied her face, noting the exhaustion and worry written there. "Are you sure you're all right? You look like you could use some help." The woman's hand moved to her stomach, and Jacob suddenly understood. She was expecting a baby, and from the look of things, she was having a difficult time of it. "I'm Catherine Crawford," she said, straightening up a little. "I'm supposed to meet with the mayor about an arrangement." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Mayor Hendricks was not a kind man, and his arrangements usually benefited him more than anyone else. "What kind of arrangement?" Catherine's eyes darted away from his. "I'm a widow," she said quietly. "My husband died 6 months ago, and I need help. The mayor said there might be work for me in town, and a place to stay until the baby comes." Something in her tone made Jacob suspect there was more to the story, but before he could ask, the sound of hoofbeats approached from the direction of town. 3 men on horseback were riding toward them, and Jacob recognized Mayor Hendricks in the lead. "Well, well," Hendricks called out as he reined in his horse. "What do we have here? Jacob Reeves playing Good Samaritan?" His eyes moved to Catherine, and his smile became predatory. "And you must be Mrs. Crawford. Right on time." Catherine straightened in her saddle, but Jacob could see her hands trembling on the reins. "Mayor Hendricks? The very same. And I see you've already met our local hero." Hendricks's tone made the word sound like an insult. "Jacob here is one of our most unique residents. Lost his legs at Gettysburg. Didn't you, Jacob?" Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his voice steady. "Mrs. Crawford was just asking for directions to town." "How convenient," Hendricks said, his smile widening. "Because I was just coming to find you, Jacob. You see, Mrs. Crawford here is in need of assistance, and the town council has decided that you're the perfect man to help her." Catherine looked confused, glancing between the 2 men. "I don't understand." "It's simple," Hendricks continued. "You need someone to help you prepare for the baby and manage your situation. And Jacob here needs something useful to do with his time. It's a perfect match." Jacob felt a trap closing around him, but he couldn't see all the edges yet. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Mrs. Crawford has inherited a small cabin about 2 miles from town. It needs work and she needs help. You'll move out there and assist her until the baby comes and she can figure out her next steps." Hendricks paused, enjoying the moment. "Unless, of course, you don't think you're up to the task." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Jacob looked at Catherine, who was staring at him with wide eyes, clearly as surprised by this development as he was. He could see the desperation in her face, the way she held herself like someone who had run out of options. But he could also see something else in Hendricks's expression. A cruel amusement that suggested this arrangement was meant to be a joke at both their expense. The broken soldier and the desperate widow, thrown together for the town's entertainment. "What do you say, Jacob?" Hendricks pressed. "Ready to be a hero again?" The mayor's office smelled like old cigars and broken promises. Jacob sat across from Hendricks's massive oak desk, feeling smaller than usual in his wheelchair. The morning sun streamed through dirty windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance around the room like spirits of all the bad decisions made within these walls. "Coffee?" Hendricks asked, pouring himself a cup from a silver pot without waiting for an answer. He was a large man who had gotten larger since the war ended, his belly straining against his vest buttons. Everything about him suggested excess, too much food, too much money, too much power over people who had too little of everything. "I'll pass," Jacob said, his hands resting carefully on his lap to hide their trembling. "Let's just get to the point of this meeting." Hendricks settled back in his leather chair, which creaked under his weight. "Direct. I like that in a man." "Very well, Jacob. The point is simple. Mrs. Crawford arrived yesterday, and she's already causing quite a stir." Through the window, Jacob could see the main street of Millfield, where people were going about their morning business. The blacksmith was already working, his hammer ringing against metal. Women carried baskets to the general store, their skirts swishing in the dust. Children chased a stray dog between the buildings. It all looked normal, peaceful even, but Jacob had learned not to trust appearances. What kind of stir? The kind that comes when a young, unmarried woman shows up in a small town, carrying a child and claiming to be a widow. Hendricks leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malicious interest. "People are asking questions. Where did she come from? Where's her husband's body? Why did she choose our little town?" Jacob felt his stomach tighten. "And what did she tell you?" "Oh, she has a story. Says her husband died in a farming accident back in Missouri. Says she sold everything to come west for a fresh start. Says she has a deed to old Jeremiah Patterson's place. You remember Jerry? Died last winter. Hendricks paused to sip his coffee. The thing is, Jacob, her story is almost too neat. Too convenient. Meaning I think our Mrs. Crawford might not be the innocent widow she claims to be. Hendricks's smile was like a snake's, cold and dangerous. But that's not really our problem, is it? Our problem is what to do with her. Jacob shifted in his chair. Why is she the town's problem at all? If she has a place to live and can support herself, can she? Hendricks interrupted. Support herself, I mean, she's 7 months along, maybe 8. That cabin of Jerry's has been empty all winter, and it wasn't in good shape when he died. No woman in her condition can manage a homestead alone, especially not with winter coming. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, and the room grew darker. Jacob could hear the wind picking up, rattling the windows. It was still summer, but on the Kansas plains you could always feel the approach of harder seasons. So what do you want from me? Hendricks set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. I want you to help her. Move out to Jerry's place. Fix what needs fixing. Help her prepare for the baby. Stay until spring, when she can make more permanent arrangements. The words hit Jacob like physical blows. You want me to move in with a woman I don't know? To help her with things I can barely manage for myself? I want you to be useful for once, Hendricks said, his voice hardening. Do you know what people say about you, Jacob? They say you're a burden. They say the town supports a man who contributes nothing in return. They wonder why we keep you around when you can't work like other men. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, and Jacob felt them hit their mark. I pay my rent. I buy my supplies. I don't ask for charity. No, but you don't give anything back either. You sit in that chair, feeling sorry for yourself, while the rest of us build this community. Hendricks stood and walked to the window, his back to Jacob. This is your chance to change that, to prove you're more than just a reminder of the war's casualties. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. And if I refuse, then I suppose we'll have to reconsider your living arrangements. That cabin you rent, it belongs to the town council. And the council has been discussing whether it might be better used for someone who can contribute more to our community's well-being. The threat was clear, and Jacob felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle over him. After the war, he'd lost everything, his legs, his farm, his future. This shabby little cabin in this dusty little town was all he had left, and now even that was being held hostage. What makes you think I can help her? I can barely help myself. Hendricks turned back to face him, and his expression had changed. The cruel amusement was still there, but now it was mixed with something that looked almost like pity. Because, Jacob, sometimes broken things can still be useful. Sometimes they can even help fix other broken things. A knock at the door interrupted them. Come in, Hendricks called. Catherine Crawford entered, and Jacob saw her clearly for the first time in good light. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 23 or 24, with the kind of beauty that came from good bones and clear eyes rather than fancy clothes or powders. But there was something fragile about her too, like a piece of fine china that had been cracked and carefully glued back together. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen better days, and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun. Her hands were calloused from work, and there was a small scar on her left temple that suggested she'd seen some hardship in her young life. Mrs. Crawford, Hendricks said, his voice taking on the false warmth he used for public occasions. Please have a seat. I was just explaining the arrangement to Mr. Reeves. Catherine sat in the chair next to Jacob's, moving carefully because of her condition. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her shoulders sagged with more than just the weight of the baby she carried. I want to be clear about something, she said, her voice steady despite the weariness. I'm not looking for charity. I can pay for any help I receive. With what? The question slipped out before Jacob could stop it, and he immediately regretted his bluntness. Catherine's cheeks colored, but her voice remained level. I have some money saved. Not much, but enough to cover expenses for a while. And I can work. I'm good with a needle, and I can cook and clean and tend a garden. All valuable skills, Hendricks agreed. But the question is whether you can manage them while managing a pregnancy and preparing for winter. That's where Mr. Reeves comes in. Jacob looked at Catherine, trying to read her expression. Did she know this was meant to be a joke? Did she understand that Hendricks was throwing them together because he thought it would be amusing to watch two desperate people try to help each other? What exactly would this arrangement involve? Catherine asked. Mr. Reeves would move into the cabin with you, temporarily, of course, and with complete propriety. He would help with the heavier work that needs to be done before winter. Chopping wood, making repairs, that sort of thing. In return, you would provide meals and household management. Catherine looked at Jacob, her green eyes searching his face. And you're willing to do this? Jacob felt the weight of both their gazes. The mayor's expectant and cruel. Catherine's hopeful and desperate. He thought about his empty cabin, his empty days, his empty life. He thought about the way people looked at him in town, with pity or disgust or uncomfortable embarrassment. But he also thought about the fear he'd seen in Catherine's eyes yesterday, and the way she'd protected her unborn child even while asking for help. There was something about her that reminded him of the best parts of himself. The parts he'd thought were buried at Gettysburg along with his legs and his dreams. Yes, he heard himself say. I'm willing. Catherine's face brightened with relief, but Jacob caught something else in her expression. A quick flash of calculation that made him wonder if she was as innocent as she appeared. Excellent, Hendricks said, clapping his hands together. I'll have the paperwork drawn up this afternoon. You can move out to the Patterson place tomorrow. As they left the mayor's office together, Jacob felt like he was walking or rolling into a story whose ending he couldn't see. Catherine walked beside his wheelchair, matching his pace without making it obvious she was slowing down for him. Thank you, she said quietly when they were out of earshot of the mayor's office. Don't thank me yet, Jacob replied. You don't know what you're getting. Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him. I know you're the first person who's offered to help me without asking for something in return. Jacob met her eyes, surprised by the directness of her gaze. How do you know I'm not asking for something in return? Because, Catherine said, placing a hand on her rounded belly. If you were, you would have said so by now. As they continued down the street, Jacob wondered if Catherine Crawford was as honest as she seemed, or if she was playing a deeper game than any of them realized. The cabin door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking like an old man's bones every time the prairie wind touched it. Jacob stared at what was supposed to be their new home, his heart sinking lower with each detail he noticed. The roof had holes big enough for birds to fly through, the windows were cracked or missing entirely, and the front steps had rotted away completely. Well, Catherine said from beside his wheelchair, her voice carefully neutral, it has character. Jacob almost laughed despite everything. That's one word for it. He rolled closer to examine the foundation, noting how the wooden supports had warped and split over the harsh Kansas winter. How long did you say Mr. Patterson lived here? The mayor said he died last December. The place has been empty since then. Catherine walked around to the side of the cabin, her hand trailing along the rough wooden walls. He was a bachelor, apparently, never married. That explained a lot, Jacob thought. A woman would never have let a place fall into this kind of condition. He watched Catherine inspect the cabin with the careful eye of someone who had learned to see potential where others saw only problems. Her movements were graceful despite her pregnancy, and she seemed to know exactly what to look for in a building's bones. The foundation is solid, she called out, and the well still has good water. I checked yesterday. Jacob rolled around to join her, surprised by her practical knowledge. You know about wells? My father was a carpenter back in Missouri. He taught me to see what could be fixed and what couldn't. Catherine's voice carried a note of sadness that suggested her father was no longer alive to share his wisdom. This place can be saved, but it's going to take work. The sun was getting lower in the sky, painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber. Jacob studied the cabin with new eyes, trying to see it as Catherine did. The roof could be patched with the spare lumber he'd spotted behind the building. The windows could be boarded up for now and replaced later. The steps could be rebuilt. But all of that would require tools he didn't have, materials he couldn't afford, and abilities he wasn't sure he still possessed. "Catherine," he said carefully, "I need to be honest with you about something. I haven't done this kind of work since before the war. I don't know if I can manage it from this chair." Catherine turned to look at him, her green eyes thoughtful. "Can you use a hammer?" "Yes." "Can you measure and cut wood?" "I think so." "Can you tell me what needs to be done, even if you can't do all of it yourself?" Jacob nodded slowly, understanding what she was asking. "You want to work together. Not just me helping you, but both of us helping each other." "That's exactly what I want." Catherine smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely hopeful. "I'm stronger than I look, and I learn fast. But I need someone who knows what they're doing to guide me." As if to prove her point, Catherine walked over to a pile of lumber and tested the weight of a board that looked far too heavy for a pregnant woman to lift. But she managed it easily, carrying it to the cabin's front wall and holding it up against a gap in the siding. "This piece could cover that hole," she said, not even breathing hard. "And if we cut it down a little, it would fit perfectly." Jacob felt something shift inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the sensation of being needed for his knowledge rather than pitted for his limitations. "We'll need to measure twice and cut once," he said, rolling closer. "And we'll want to seal the edges to keep the wind out." They spent the next hour walking and rolling around the cabin, making lists of what needed to be fixed and what materials they would need. Catherine proved to have an excellent eye for detail, noticing problems Jacob might have missed and suggesting solutions he wouldn't have thought of. As the sun began to set, they found themselves sitting on the cabin's back step, the only one that wasn't completely rotted through, sharing the simple supper Catherine had packed. Bread and cheese and apples, along with water from the well that tasted surprisingly sweet. "Can I ask you something?" Jacob said as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Of course. Why did you really come to Millfield? I mean, what made you choose this particular town?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her belly where the baby was moving restlessly. "My husband used to talk about the frontier," she said finally. "He said it was a place where people could start over, where your past didn't matter as much as what you were willing to build. And you believed him?" "I wanted to." Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "I needed to believe that there was somewhere I could go where nobody knew my story." Jacob heard the pain in her words and recognized it. He'd been running from his own story for 3 years, trying to find a place where he could be something other than the broken soldier who'd lost everything at Gettysburg. "What's your story, Catherine?" She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day. "Maybe someday I'll tell you, when I know you better." She paused, then added, "What's yours?" Jacob considered the question. The easy answer was the war, his injuries, his fall from respected member of society to object of pity. But sitting here beside this woman who was clearly carrying secrets of her own, he realized there was more to his story than just what he'd lost. "I used to believe I was put on this earth to protect people," he said slowly. "First my family, then my fellow soldiers, then anyone who needed help. When I lost my legs, I thought I'd lost my purpose too. And now," Jacob looked at the broken cabin that somehow felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived since the war. "Now I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong about what it means to protect people." A coyote howled in the distance, its voice carrying across the endless prairie. Catherine shivered and moved a little closer to Jacob's wheelchair, not quite touching but close enough that he could feel her warmth. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "You? Every day." Catherine smiled ruefully. "But less today than yesterday." As they prepared to return to town for their last night in separate homes, Jacob realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were partners in something that might actually work. But as they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Jacob noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks in the dirt around the cabin, tracks that hadn't been there when they arrived. Someone had been watching them, and whoever it was had taken care to stay hidden. "Catherine," he said quietly, "We're not alone out here." She followed his gaze to the tracks, and he saw her face go pale in the moonlight. "How long do you think they were watching?" "Long enough," Jacob replied, his mind already working on the implications. Someone in Millfield was very interested in their arrangement, and not in a friendly way. As they made their way back to town, both of them kept looking over their shoulders, wondering who might be following them and why. The partnership that had felt so promising an hour ago now seemed dangerous, like they were walking into a trap neither of them fully understood. Blood dripped from Catherine's finger onto the wooden floor of her temporary room above the general store. She'd been trying to mend a torn curtain by lamplight when the needle slipped, but the small wound felt like the least of her problems as she watched Jacob struggle with the heavy trunk that held all her worldly possessions. "Let me help," she said, wrapping her finger in a piece of cloth. "I've got it," Jacob replied through gritted teeth, his face red with effort as he tried to maneuver the trunk down the narrow stairs. His wheelchair couldn't fit in the stairwell, so he'd had to crawl down backwards, dragging the trunk behind him one step at a time. Catherine wanted to argue, but she could see the fierce pride in his eyes that told her this was about more than just moving furniture. This was about Jacob proving to himself that he could still be useful, still be the man who protected and provided for others. The sound of Jacob's struggle echoed through the building, and soon Mrs. Peterson appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face pinched with worry and disapproval. "This is highly irregular," she said, wringing her hands in her apron. "An unmarried woman moving in with a man, even temporarily. People are already talking." "Let them talk," Catherine replied, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. She'd heard the whispers when she walked through town yesterday, seen the way women pulled their children closer when she passed. "We're not doing anything wrong. The appearance of wrong is often worse than wrong itself," Mrs. Peterson said primly, "especially for a woman in your condition." Jacob finally reached the bottom of the stairs, breathing hard and sweating despite the cool morning air. "Mrs. Peterson," he said politely, "Catherine and I appreciate your concern, but we're both adults making a practical arrangement." "Practical?" Mrs. Peterson repeated, as if the word tasted sour. "That's what they all say at first." After they loaded Catherine's belongings into the wagon Jacob had borrowed, they set out for the Patterson cabin. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of blue sky that made the prairie look endless and full of possibility. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched as they left town. "Do you think she's right?" Catherine asked as they bounced along the rough track. "About people talking?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the wagon's reins despite their usual trembling. "People always talk. The question is whether you let their talk change what you know is right." "And you think this is right?" "I think two people helping each other survive isn't anybody else's business," Jacob said firmly. Then, more softly, "Don't you?" Catherine placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her. "I think I don't have many other choices." When they reached the cabin, they found evidence that someone had been there during the night. The lumber pile had been scattered, and several boards were missing entirely. Worse, someone had used a knife to carve words into the cabin's front door, "whore" and "cripple," in letters deep enough to splinter the wood. Catherine felt like she'd been slapped. The words were meant to hurt, and they succeeded. Beside her, Jacob's face had gone very still, the way it did when he was trying to control his anger. "Do you know who might have done this?" she asked. "Could be anyone," Jacob replied, but his voice suggested he had suspicions. "There are people in town who don't like changes to their comfortable routines." Catherine walked closer to examine the carved words, her finger tracing the rough edges where the knife had cut deep. "They don't even know me. How can they hate me already?" "It's not really about you," Jacob said, rolling his wheelchair up beside her. "It's about what you represent. A woman without a man to control her. A stranger with secrets. Someone who doesn't fit into their neat little categories. And you? What do you represent that makes them so angry?" Jacob was quiet for a long time, staring at the word cripple, as if he could make it disappear through will alone. "I represent what they're all afraid of becoming. Broken. Useless. dependent on others' kindness. Catherine felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. You're not useless. No. Jacob's laugh was bitter. I can't even move my own belongings without crawling down stairs like an animal. You can think. You can plan. You can see solutions I would never find on my own. Catherine turned to face him fully. And you chose to help me when you didn't have to. That's not useless. That's brave. For a moment, Jacob's carefully controlled expression cracked, and Catherine could see the pain he carried like a weight on his shoulders. Then he straightened up and reached for the toolbox they'd brought from town. We have work to do, he said, and whoever did this is probably hoping we'll give up and go back to town with our tails between our legs. Are we going to? Jacob's smile was sharp as a blade. Not a chance. They spent the day working together in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Catherine proved to be as strong and capable as she'd claimed, lifting heavy boards and climbing up to patch holes in the roof that Jacob couldn't reach from his wheelchair. Jacob directed the work with the confidence of someone who'd built and repaired many structures, his knowledge filling in the gaps in Catherine's experience. By afternoon, they'd managed to make the cabin weatherproof, if not beautiful. The carved words were still on the door, but Jacob had showed Catherine how to sand them down until they were barely visible. It's not perfect, Catherine said as they stepped back to admire their work, but it's ours. The word hung in the air between them. Ours. It suggested a partnership, a shared investment in something bigger than either of them alone. Catherine hadn't meant to say it, but now that it was out there, she found she didn't want to take it back. Yes, Jacob said quietly. It is. As the sun began to set, they prepared their first meal in the cabin together. Catherine cooked beans and cornbread on the wood stove, while Jacob organized their supplies and planned the next day's work. The domestic routine felt both strange and comforting, like playing house with higher stakes. Jacob, Catherine said as they sat down to eat, can I ask you about the war? His fork paused halfway to his mouth. What about it? What was it like? Before you were hurt, what was it like to be a soldier? Jacob set down his fork and looked out the small window at the darkening prairie. It was like being part of something bigger than yourself. Like your life had meaning because you were fighting for something important. He paused. Of course, that was before I understood that most wars aren't really about the things they tell you they're about. What are they about? Power. Money. Old men sending young men to die for causes that matter more in speeches than in reality. Jacob's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. I lost my legs defending a hill that we abandoned 2 days later. Turned out it wasn't strategically important after all. Catherine reached across the table and touched his hand. His fingers were rough and calloused from years of hard work, but they were warm and steady under hers. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For the hill. For the war. For the way people treat you now. Catherine's voice was fierce. You deserved better. Jacob turned his hand over so their palms were touching. So did you. They sat like that as darkness fell around the cabin, their hands connected across the simple wooden table. Outside, the prairie wind sang through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate. For the first time in months, Catherine felt like she might be safe. For the first time in years, Jacob felt like he might be home. But neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows beyond the window, taking careful note of their growing closeness and planning how best to use that information against them. The scream that tore from Catherine's throat at 3 in the morning could have woken the dead. Jacob jerked awake in his bedroll near the fireplace, his soldier's instincts immediately alert as he searched for the source of danger. Another scream came from the small bedroom, followed by Catherine's voice calling his name in a way that made his blood turn to ice. Jacob, something's wrong with the baby. He transferred from his bedroll to his wheelchair faster than he'd moved since the war, rolling toward her room without bothering to put on his shirt. Catherine was sitting on the edge of her bed, doubled over in pain, her nightgown soaked with sweat and something darker that made Jacob's stomach clench with fear. How long have you been having pains? He asked, forcing his voice to stay calm while his mind raced through everything he knew about childbirth, which wasn't nearly enough for a situation like this. Since midnight, Catherine gasped between contractions. But they're getting stronger and it's too early. The baby isn't supposed to come for another month. Jacob rolled closer, noting the pallor of her skin and the way her hands shook as she gripped the bedsheets. He'd seen enough wounded soldiers to recognize when someone was in real trouble, and Catherine was definitely in real trouble. "We need to get you to town," he said. "There's a woman there, Mrs. Williams, who helps with births." "No." Catherine's voice was sharp with panic. "It's the middle of the night, and the roads are too rough. I won't make it that far, and neither will the baby." As if to prove her point, another contraction seized her, stronger than the last. Catherine bit down on her lower lip to keep from screaming, but Jacob could see the terror in her eyes, not just fear of pain, but fear of losing the child that represented her only connection to the life she'd left behind. "Then we do this here," Jacob said with more confidence than he felt. "Tell me what you need." For the next several hours, Jacob became something he'd never expected to be, a partner in the ancient dance of bringing life into the world. Catherine guided him through the process with the knowledge women seemed to carry in their bones, while Jacob provided the steady presence and practical assistance that kept them both from falling apart. He heated water on the stove, tore clean sheets into strips, and positioned himself beside the bed where Catherine could grip his hand during the worst contractions. His own hands, which had shaken with remembered trauma for 3 years, became rock steady when Catherine needed them most. "Tell me about your husband," Jacob said during a brief lull between pains, hoping to distract her from what was happening to her body. Catherine's eyes focused on something beyond the cabin walls. "He was gentle," she said softly. "He never raised his voice, never raised his hand. He used to sing while he worked in the fields, old songs his mother taught him." "What was his favorite song?" "Amazing Grace." He said it reminded him that everyone deserved a second chance, no matter what they'd done before. Catherine's voice broke a little. "He would have loved this baby so much." Jacob squeezed her hand. "He does love this baby. Love like that doesn't die just because the person does." As dawn approached, the contractions became more intense and closer together. Catherine was exhausting herself fighting against the pain instead of working with it, and Jacob could see that she was losing strength fast. "Catherine, look at me," he said firmly. "You're fighting this like it's your enemy, but it's not. The pain is bringing your baby to you. Stop fighting it and let it do its work." "I can't," she whispered. "It hurts too much." "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I've ever met." Jacob moved his wheelchair closer so he could look directly into her eyes. "You left everything you knew to come here. You're building a new life from nothing. You can do this too." Something in his voice must have reached her, because Catherine's expression changed. Instead of fighting the next contraction, she breathed through it, working with her body instead of against it. "That's it," Jacob encouraged. "You've got this." The sun was fully up when the baby finally decided to make her appearance. She came into the world small but fierce, announcing her arrival with lungs that suggested she had every intention of making her presence known. Jacob found himself holding a tiny, wrinkled human being who weighed no more than a sack of flour but somehow felt like the most important thing he'd ever been trusted with. "Is she?" Catherine asked weakly. "She's perfect," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a voice that could wake the whole territory. He carefully placed the baby in Catherine's arms, watching as her face transformed with a love so pure and immediate that it made his chest ache. This was what he'd been fighting for during the war. He realized not abstract concepts like freedom or democracy, but moments like this where life continued and love triumphed over everything that tried to destroy it. "Hello, little one," Catherine whispered to her daughter. "I'm your mama, and this is—" She looked up at Jacob with eyes full of tears and gratitude. "This is Jacob. He helped bring you into the world." The baby stopped crying and seemed to focus on Jacob's face with the intense concentration that newborns sometimes showed. Her tiny hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength, and Jacob felt something break open inside his chest. Not the sharp fracture of loss he'd carried since the war, but the gentle opening of ground that had been frozen too long, ready at last for new growth. "What will you name her?" he asked. Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying her daughter's face. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." Outside, the Kansas wind sang through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of harder days ahead. But inside the small cabin, three people who had been broken by life in different ways had somehow managed to create something whole and beautiful together. Jacob knew that the world outside would have opinions about what had happened here, an unmarried woman giving birth with only a disabled man to help her. But he also knew that he'd never been more useful, more needed, or more alive than he had been in the hours just past. As Catherine and baby Hope fell asleep in the morning light, Jacob sat guard beside them, his hands finally steady, his purpose finally clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "That baby's crying is going to bring every coyote within 10 miles, Jacob said, but his voice was gentle as he watched Catherine pace the cabin floor, trying to soothe little Hope. 3 days had passed since the birth, and none of them had gotten much sleep. Catherine looked exhausted, her hair escaping from its braid and dark circles under her eyes. But there was something new in her face too, a fierce protective love that made her seem stronger rather than weaker. "She's just hungry again. I think she's trying to make up for being born early." Jacob had been amazed by how quickly Catherine had taken to motherhood. Despite her exhaustion, she seemed to know instinctively what Hope needed, whether it was feeding or changing or just the comfort of being held. Watching them together stirred feelings in Jacob that he'd thought were buried forever. "You're good at this," he said, rolling his wheelchair closer to where she stood by the window. "I don't feel good at it. I feel like I'm making everything up as I go along." Catherine adjusted the baby's blanket with practiced movements that suggested she was better at this than she thought. "What if I do something wrong? What if she gets sick and I don't know how to help her?" "Then we figure it out together," Jacob said simply. "That's what partners do." The word partners hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either of them had intended. Over the past few days, they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Jacob handling the outdoor work he could manage from his wheelchair, while Catherine focused on caring for Hope and recovering from the birth. But Jacob could see the worry in Catherine's eyes that went beyond the normal concerns of a new mother. She kept glancing toward the door as if expecting unwelcome visitors, and she startled every time the wind rattled the windows. "Catherine, what aren't you telling me?" She stopped pacing and looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been caught in a lie. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're scared of something besides being a new mother. You keep watching the road like you're expecting someone to come looking for you." Catherine sat down heavily in the chair across from him, Hope still fussing in her arms. For a long moment, the only sounds in the cabin were the baby's cries and the wind outside. Then Catherine began to speak, her voice so quiet Jacob had to lean forward to hear her. "My husband didn't die in a farming accident," she said. "He was murdered." Jacob felt his stomach drop. "Murdered by who?" "His brother. My brother-in-law, Thomas." Catherine's voice was flat, emotionless, as if she was talking about something that had happened to someone else. "Thomas wanted the farm, but Ben inherited it when their father died. Thomas said it wasn't fair, that Ben was too soft to make the farm profitable. So he killed him for land? He made it look like an accident. Ben fell from the barn roof while fixing it, just like I told the mayor. But I saw Thomas climbing down from the roof right before I found Ben's body." Catherine's hands tightened protectively around Hope. "When I accused him, he laughed. Said no one would believe me, and even if they did, he was family and I was just a woman." Jacob felt anger building in his chest. Not the helpless rage he'd carried since the war, but something cleaner and more focused. "Why didn't you go to the law? Thomas is the sheriff in our county. His best friend is the judge." Catherine's laugh was bitter. "I tried to fight him in court anyway, but he had witnesses who swore they saw Ben working alone on the roof. Suddenly, I was the grieving widow who was imagining things because of her condition." "Your condition?" Catherine looked down at Hope, who had finally stopped crying and was looking up at her mother with dark, serious eyes. "I was already pregnant when Ben died. Thomas said if I didn't sign over the farm to him, he'd make sure I lost the baby too. He said accidents happened all the time to women in my condition. Jacob understood now why Catherine had run, why she'd chosen a place as remote as Millfield to start over. She wasn't just a widow seeking a fresh start. She was a woman fleeing for her life and the life of her unborn child. Does he know where you are? I don't think so. I sold everything I could, took Ben's name off all the papers, and traveled at night for the first week. But Thomas is persistent, and he has friends who owe him favors. Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. I keep thinking I see riders watching the cabin. It's probably just my imagination, but it's not imagination, Jacob said grimly. I've seen them too. Catherine went pale. What? Riders staying just far enough away that I can't make out their faces. They've been there for 2 days watching us. Jacob reached over and touched her hand. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Because you didn't sign up to hide a fugitive. You agreed to help a widow, not protect someone from a killer. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet about it, it would all just go away. Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the frightened woman who'd stumbled into his life, but the brave person who'd risked everything to protect her child. She'd given birth in a frontier cabin with only him to help her, had worked beside him to build a home from nothing, had trusted him with her deepest fears. Catherine, look at me. When she met his eyes, Jacob's voice was steady and sure. I didn't just agree to help a widow. I agreed to help you. All of you, including the parts you were afraid to show me. Even knowing that being here puts you in danger too? Jacob thought about that question seriously. 3 years ago, he would have said that he'd already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to lose. But sitting in this cabin with Catherine and Hope, he realized that wasn't true anymore. He'd found something worth protecting again. Especially knowing that, he said finally. Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance, and both Jacob and Catherine froze. It was too close to be wild horses, and too late in the day for friendly visitors. Get Hope and go to the back room, Jacob said quietly, his soldier's training taking over. Stay there until I tell you it's safe. Catherine didn't argue. She gathered the baby and her few precious belongings, disappearing into the bedroom and closing the door behind her. Jacob rolled his wheelchair to the front window and peered carefully through the gap in the curtains. 3 riders sat on a hill about a quarter-mile away, close enough that he could see they were watching the cabin but far enough that he couldn't make out their faces. They'd been there for almost an hour, just watching and waiting. As Jacob studied them, one of the riders raised his hand in a mocking salute, as if he knew he was being observed. Then all 3 turned their horses and rode away, disappearing into the gathering dusk like shadows. Jacob remained at the window long after they were gone, his mind working through possibilities and preparations. Thomas might not know exactly where Catherine was yet, but he was getting closer. And when he finally found her, Jacob intended to be ready. He'd failed to protect his fellow soldiers at Gettysburg, but he wouldn't fail to protect Catherine and Hope. Not this time. Not when it mattered most. The barn was on fire, and Jacob could smell the smoke before he could see the flames. He bolted upright from his bedroll, his heart hammering as orange light flickered through the cabin windows like some terrible sunrise come too early. Outside, he could hear the crackle of burning wood and the terrified neighing of their horse trapped inside. Catherine, he shouted, rolling toward her room. The barn's burning. She emerged, clutching Hope to her chest, her eyes wide with fear and the immediate understanding of what this meant. The barn held their winter feed, their tools, their only horse, everything they needed to survive the coming cold months. Is it Thomas? She whispered. Jacob was already moving toward the door, his mind calculating angles and possibilities the way he'd learned during the war. Doesn't matter who started it. What matters is stopping it before it spreads to the cabin. But even as he said the words, Jacob could see embers floating on the night wind, landing dangerously close to their roof. The prairie was dry from weeks without rain, and everything around them was ready to burn like kindling. Catherine thrust Hope into his arms and grabbed the 2 water buckets by the door. You stay with her. I'll try to save what I can. No. Jacob's voice carried an authority that surprised them both. You can't fight this fire alone, and I can't protect Hope if you're in danger. He looked directly into her eyes. We do this together, or we lose everything together. For a moment, Catherine looked like she might argue. Then she nodded, understanding that this wasn't about what either of them could or couldn't do. It was about what they could accomplish as a team. The root cellar, Jacob said. Hope will be safe there while we work. They carried the baby to the small underground storage room behind the cabin, wrapping her in blankets and placing her in a wooden crate that would protect her from smoke. Hope fussed at being separated from her mother, but Catherine sang softly to her until she settled. We'll be right back, little one, Catherine promised, though Jacob could hear the fear in her voice. Outside, the fire had consumed half the barn and was reaching hungry fingers toward the cabin's roof. Jacob positioned himself where he could see the whole scene, his battlefield experience helping him understand how fire moved and where it would strike next. Catherine, we need to soak the cabin roof, he called over the roar of flames. There's a ladder against the back wall. What followed became a dance between partners who had learned to trust each other completely. Catherine climbed onto the roof with buckets of water while Jacob organized their defense from his wheelchair, his voice carrying clear commands across the chaos. His understanding of wind patterns and fire behavior, learned in too many burned-out towns during the war, proved invaluable as he directed their efforts. The wind's shifting, he shouted. Move to the east side. That's where the embers will hit next. Catherine moved without hesitation, trusting his judgment even when she couldn't see what he saw. Her movements on the roof were sure and quick, and Jacob found himself amazed by her courage. Most people would have panicked, but Catherine worked with the focused determination of someone who had already lost too much to lose anything else. As they fought the fire, neighbors began arriving from surrounding homesteads. The Johnsons from 2 miles south, the Martinez family from the next valley over, even old Pete Williams who lived alone and rarely spoke to anyone. Fire was the enemy of everyone on the frontier, and people who might not speak to each other for months would drop everything to help fight it. Jacob, called Tom Johnson as he rode up with his sons. What do you need? Water and shovels, Jacob replied without missing a beat. We need to create a fire break between the barn and the cabin. The next hour passed in a blur of smoke and sweat and shouted instructions. Jacob found himself directing a crew of men who had once pitted him, his military training and natural leadership taking over as he coordinated their efforts. No one questioned his authority or suggested someone else should be in charge. They simply followed his orders because his orders made sense and kept them all safe. Catherine worked alongside the men without anyone suggesting she shouldn't, her pregnancy and recent childbirth forgotten in the face of immediate necessity. She carried water, threw dirt on sparks, and climbed back onto the roof whenever new embers threatened the cabin. When dawn finally came, the barn was gone but the cabin stood intact. Everyone was exhausted, covered in soot, and singed around the edges, but they were alive and their home was saved. How did it start? Asked Tom Johnson as they stood looking at the smoldering remains of the barn. Jacob and Catherine exchanged glances. They both knew this hadn't been an accident, but saying so would raise questions they weren't ready to answer. Hard to say, Jacob replied carefully. Could have been anything in this dry weather. But as the neighbors prepared to leave, old Pete Williams pulled Jacob aside. His weathered face was serious, and his voice was low enough that only Jacob could hear. Saw 3 riders heading away from here right after the fire started, Pete said. Moving fast, like they didn't want to be seen. Jacob felt his stomach tighten. Did you recognize them? Strangers. But they were watching your place for days before this happened. Pete's eyes were sharp despite his age. You got trouble coming, son. The kind that won't stop with just burning barns. As the last of the neighbors rode away, Jacob and Catherine stood looking at the destruction of their barn. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built together, had been reduced to ashes and memories. He's escalating, Catherine said quietly, bouncing Hope in her arms. The baby had slept through most of the excitement, protected in her underground refuge. Thomas doesn't just want to scare me anymore. He wants to destroy everything I've tried to build. Jacob studied the blackened remains, his mind already working on plans and preparations. Then we escalate too. What do you mean? Jacob turned his wheelchair to face her fully. I mean, we stop running and start fighting back. Thomas thinks he can terrorize you because you're alone and powerless. But you're not alone anymore. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something that looked like relief. You really mean that? I mean it. Jacob's voice was steady and sure. I failed to protect people I cared about once before. I won't fail again. Above them, the Kansas sky was beginning to clear as the smoke drifted away on the morning wind. The immediate crisis was over, but both Jacob and Catherine knew that the real battle was just beginning. As they walked back toward the cabin to assess the damage and plan their next moves, neither of them noticed the single rider watching from the distant hills, taking careful note of everything he'd seen and preparing to report back to the man who'd sent him. The war for Catherine's freedom was about to begin in earnest, and Jacob intended to make sure they won it. Mayor Hendricks arrived with Sheriff Morrison and two strangers just as Jacob was splitting kindling behind what remained of their barn. The sound of multiple horses approaching made his blood run cold, especially when he saw the hard faces of the men riding with officials he already didn't trust. Mrs. Crawford, Hendricks called out in his false, friendly voice. We need to have a word with you. Catherine emerged from the cabin with hope in her arms, her face carefully neutral despite the fear Jacob could see in her eyes. She'd been expecting this visit ever since the fire, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. Gentlemen, she said politely, though her grip tightened protectively around the baby. What can I do for you? One of the strangers dismounted, a tall man with cold eyes and the kind of smile that never reached past his teeth. I'm Deputy Marshal Thompson from Missouri. I'm here about some missing property that belongs to Thomas Crawford. Jacob felt anger build in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was the moment Catherine had been running from, and how they handled it would determine everything that came next. I'm not sure what property you're referring to, Catherine said carefully. Now, Mrs. Crawford, Thompson said, his voice carrying mock sympathy. Let's not play games. Your brother-in-law has been very worried about you. Says you disappeared with some valuable items that belonged to his deceased brother. My husband's belongings belong to me as his widow. That's a matter of some dispute, Sheriff Morrison interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but following orders. Mr. Thomas Crawford has paperwork suggesting otherwise. Thompson reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. This here's a court order from Judge Williams in Missouri. Says you're to return with us to face charges of theft and abandonment of marital property. Jacob rolled his wheelchair closer, studying the paper with the careful attention he'd learned to give legal documents since the war. Something about it didn't look right. The paper was too new, the ink too fresh, and there were details that seemed suspicious to someone who dealt with military paperwork. This document is dated yesterday, Jacob said quietly. How did you travel from Missouri to Kansas in one day? Thompson's smile faltered slightly. We've been tracking Mrs. Crawford for some time. The judge issued the order when we reported finding her location. And what location would that be? Jacob pressed. Because according to this paper, it says she was found in the town of Millfield, Kansas Territory. But it doesn't mention this specific homestead, which is 2 miles outside of town. Catherine looked at Jacob with surprise and growing hope. She hadn't noticed the discrepancies in the document, but Jacob's military experience with official papers was revealing problems that could save her life. Furthermore, Jacob continued, his voice taking on the authority he'd once used as a sergeant. This paper claims Mrs. Crawford abandoned marital property, but as her husband's widow, she would have inherited everything automatically under Kansas territorial law. Mayor Hendricks shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Jacob, I don't think you understand the complexities of legal matters. I understand fraud when I see it, Jacob replied sharply. And I understand that Kansas territory doesn't recognize Missouri's authority to arrest our citizens without proper federal jurisdiction. Thompson's friendly mask was starting to slip, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. You're interfering with official business, cripple. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jacob felt the familiar rage rise in his chest, but this time it was tempered by something stronger, the need to protect Catherine and hope from men who would destroy them for money and spite. "My name is Jacob Reeves," he said with quiet dignity. "I'm a veteran of the Union Army and a citizen of Kansas Territory, and unless you have proper federal warrants signed by a territorial judge, you have no authority here." Sheriff Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Maybe we should check with the territorial courthouse before we proceed." "No need for that," Thompson said, his hand moving toward his gun. "We have our orders, and we're taking the woman back with us." "Over my dead body," Jacob said simply. The words created a moment of perfect silence, broken only by the sound of wind through the prairie grass and Hope's soft breathing in her mother's arms. Everyone present understood that the situation had just escalated beyond legal arguments into something much more dangerous. But then a new voice joined the conversation. "Nobody's dying today unless I say so." Tom Johnson sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, his hunting rifle resting casually across his saddle. Behind him, Jacob could see his two grown sons, both armed and both looking like they were ready for trouble. "This is a private matter," Thompson said, but his hand moved away from his gun. "Fire affects everyone on the frontier," Tom replied calmly, "and we don't take kindly to strangers who bring trouble to our neighbors." He looked directly at Thompson. "Especially strangers who start fires and then show up with convenient paperwork the next day." Thompson's face went pale. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Tom's voice was steady and sure. "Pete Williams saw you and your men near this place the night of the fire. And now you show up with papers that don't look quite right, trying to take away a woman and her newborn baby." More riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, the Martinez family, old Pete Williams himself, and several other neighbors Jacob recognized. Word had spread about the confrontation, and the frontier community had rallied to protect one of their own. Sheriff Morrison looked around at the growing crowd of armed neighbors and made a decision that probably saved several lives. "Deputy Thompson," he said formally, "I think we need to return to town and verify these documents through proper channels." Thompson's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter, but he could see that the situation had turned against him. "This isn't over," he said to Catherine. "Thomas Crawford doesn't give up easily." "Neither do we," Jacob replied, and his voice carried the promise of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. As the unwelcome visitors rode away, the neighbors gathered around Jacob and Catherine, offering support and asking what they could do to help. For the first time since arriving in Kansas Territory, Catherine found herself surrounded by people who were willing to stand up for her simply because she was one of them. "Thank you," she said to Tom Johnson, tears in her eyes. "All of you. I don't know how to repay this kindness." "You don't repay kindness," Tom replied with a smile. "You pass it on." As the crowd dispersed and normal life resumed, Jacob and Catherine sat on their front step, watching the sun set over the prairie. Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her future had just been secured by the courage of neighbors who barely knew her name. "It's not over," Catherine said quietly. "Thomas will find another way." "Maybe," Jacob agreed. "But now he knows he's not just fighting you anymore. He's fighting all of us." Catherine looked at him with an expression that held gratitude, affection, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. "How did you know those papers were fake?" Jacob smiled, feeling more useful and capable than he had since before the war. "Sometimes being broken teaches you to recognize when other things are broken too." As night fell over the Kansas prairie, Jacob realized that he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever at Gettysburg, the ability to protect the people he cared about. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. The marriage proposal came out of Jacob's mouth like a bullet he couldn't call back. Mayor Hendricks had arrived that morning with 2 city officials and threats about Catherine's fitness as a mother. But instead of backing down, Jacob had reached into his shirt pocket for the deed to his family farm in Ohio and asked Catherine to be his wife. Now they all stood frozen in the afternoon sun, Hendricks with his face turning red, the city men looking confused, and Catherine staring at Jacob like he'd just offered to lasso the moon for her. "Did you just?" Catherine whispered. "I did." Jacob's hands were steady on his wheelchair for the first time in months as he looked directly into her eyes. "Not out of pity or desperation, but because I love you, both of you, and because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about helping each other survive and started being about building something worth keeping." Catherine's free hand went to her throat, and Jacob could see her mind working through the implications. A marriage would make it nearly impossible for Thomas to claim she was an unfit mother. It would give Hope legal protection and Catherine the security of Jacob's name and property. But more than that, Jacob realized as he watched her face, it would make official what had already become true in their hearts. "This is preposterous," Hendricks sputtered. "A sham marriage won't fool anyone with eyes. Won't it?" Catherine stepped forward, her voice gaining strength with each word. "A man who works from dawn to dusk to provide for his family? Who delivered my baby when no one else was there? Who fought fire to save our home and stood up to armed men to protect us?" She looked directly at Hendricks. "That sounds like more of a real husband than most women ever find." One of the city officials, a thin man with wire spectacles, cleared his throat. Even if such a marriage were legitimate, there would still be questions about living arrangements, moral conduct, the welfare of the child. What questions? Tom Johnson's voice cut across the conversation like a blade. Jacob hadn't heard him ride up, but there he was with his two sons, all three armed and looking like they were ready to settle this discussion permanently. Behind them came more neighbors, the Martinez family, old Pete Williams, even Mrs. Kowalski from the Polish settlement 5 miles east. Word had spread faster than prairie fire, and half the county seemed to be converging on their little homestead. "This is a private family matter," the thin official said nervously. "Family matters are community matters out here," declared Mrs. Martinez, a formidable woman who'd raised 6 children on the frontier and wasn't impressed by city officials. "And this community says Jacob Reeves is a good man who's found himself a good woman. They've built something honest together," added Pete Williams. "More honest than most of what passes for marriage in town." Jacob felt something shift in the air around them. These people weren't just supporting Catherine's right to keep her child. They were embracing both of them as permanent members of their community. The broken soldier and the desperate widow had somehow become the family that everyone was willing to defend. Sheriff Morrison, who'd been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Seems to me like a private matter between consenting adults. Not sure what business it is of ours." Hendricks's face had progressed through several shades of red and was approaching purple. "This is a mockery of proper society." "No," Catherine said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. "A mockery of proper society is when powerful men try to destroy women who won't submit to their control. A mockery is when people judge others without knowing their struggles or their hearts." She walked over to Jacob's wheelchair and took his hand, not the desperate grip of someone drowning, but the deliberate connection of someone choosing her partner. "Jacob Reeves," she said formally, "I accept your proposal, not because I need rescuing, but because you're the first man who's ever seen me as strong enough to be his equal partner." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Jacob barely heard them. He was focused entirely on Catherine's face, on the smile that transformed her from beautiful to radiant, on the way she looked at him like he was the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to speak aloud. "When?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Now," Catherine replied. "Before anyone can think of more reasons why we shouldn't." Mrs. Martinez stepped forward. "My husband was ordained before we came west. He can perform the ceremony." "I'll stand as witness," declared Tom Johnson. "We all will," added Pete Williams, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. What followed was unlike any wedding Jacob had ever imagined. No church, no fancy clothes, no elaborate ceremony. Just 2 people promising to choose each other every day, surrounded by neighbors who'd become family and under a Kansas sky that stretched endless and blue with possibility. Mr. Martinez spoke the traditional words in his careful English, but he added something of his own. Marriage on the frontier isn't about pretty words or fancy celebrations. It's about two people deciding they're stronger together than apart, and having the courage to prove it every day. When Jacob and Catherine kissed to seal their union, Hope chose that moment to wake up and add her voice to the celebration, as if she approved of the proceedings. The crowd laughed and someone started singing, and for a moment it felt like the whole prairie was celebrating with them. But even in the midst of joy, Jacob noticed that the city officials and Mayor Hendricks were huddled together, talking in low voices and looking like men who weren't ready to admit defeat. The legal battle might be over for now, but the war for Catherine's freedom was far from finished. As the impromptu wedding celebration continued around them, Jacob caught Catherine's eye and saw his own understanding reflected there. They'd won this round, but Thomas Crawford wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. He'd find another way to come after them, and next time he'd be better prepared. But they would be ready too. They were no longer two broken people trying to survive alone. They were a family, backed by a community that had chosen to stand with them. Whatever Thomas threw at them next, they would face it together. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead. Jacob reached for his wife's hand, his wife. He marveled at the words, and felt something he'd thought was lost forever at Gettysburg. He felt like he was finally home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt too peaceful to contain bad news. Jacob was teaching Hope to wave her tiny fist at the chickens while Catherine hung laundry on the line they'd strung between two posts. 3 weeks had passed since their wedding, and they'd fallen into the kind of domestic rhythm that made their hasty marriage feel like the most natural thing in the world. "Jacob," Catherine called from where she stood reading the paper the mail carrier had delivered. "You need to see this." The tone of her voice made his stomach clench with familiar dread. Jacob rolled his wheelchair over to where she stood, Hope gurgling contentedly in his lap, and took the official-looking document she handed him. It was a court summons from the territorial court in Topeka, written in the formal language that always meant trouble for ordinary people. As Jacob read, his heart sank lower with each legal phrase. "Thomas is challenging our marriage," he said grimly. "He's claiming it was fraudulent, entered into solely to avoid his legitimate custody claims over Hope." Catherine sank onto the wooden crate they used as a chair, her face pale. "Can he do that?" "He's doing it." Jacob studied the summons more carefully, noting dates and requirements. "We have to appear in Topeka within 2 weeks to defend the validity of our marriage, or the court will rule in his favor by default." The implications hung between them like storm clouds. If Thomas succeeded in having their marriage declared invalid, Catherine would be back where she started, a single mother with no legal protection and a powerful enemy who wanted to destroy her. "There's more," Jacob said quietly, reading the fine print. "He's also filed papers claiming that my disabilities make me unfit to serve as Hope's guardian. Says a man in a wheelchair can't provide proper protection for a family." Catherine's hands clenched into fists. "How dare he?" "He dares because he thinks it'll work." Jacob folded the summons carefully, his mind already working on strategy and possibilities. "The question is, how do we prove him wrong?" Over the next few days, they prepared for the legal battle with the same methodical care they'd used to rebuild their cabin. Jacob wrote letters to his former commanding officers, requesting testimonials about his character and abilities. Catherine gathered every document she could find that proved her marriage to Ben had been legitimate and that she was Hope's rightful mother. But as the day of their court appearance approached, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Thomas wouldn't have risked a public court battle unless he was confident of winning, and that meant he had evidence or arguments they hadn't anticipated. The journey to Topeka took 2 days by wagon, with Jacob managing the reins while Catherine cared for Hope. They'd borrowed the wagon from Tom Johnson, along with his promise to look after their homestead while they were gone. The gesture of trust and friendship meant more to Jacob than he could express. Topeka was bigger than any town Jacob had seen since before the war, with actual paved streets and buildings more than 2 stories tall. The territorial courthouse was an imposing stone structure that made their legal troubles feel even more overwhelming. Inside, they found Thomas Crawford waiting with a lawyer who looked expensive and confident. Thomas was a big man, soft around the middle, but with hard eyes that reminded Jacob of certain officers he'd known during the war, men who enjoyed having power over others. "Catherine," Thomas said with false warmth as they entered the courtroom, "you're looking well, and this must be my brother's child." His gaze lingered on Hope with a possessiveness that made Jacob's skin crawl. This wasn't about love or family. It was about ownership and control. "She's my daughter," Catherine said firmly. "Ben's daughter, not yours." "We'll see what the court decides about that," Thomas replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. The hearing that followed was unlike anything Jacob had experienced, even during his court-martial proceedings after Gettysburg. Thomas's lawyer painted a picture of Catherine as an unstable woman who'd fled her responsibilities and entered into a fraudulent marriage with a disabled man who couldn't provide proper care for a child. "Your Honor," the lawyer argued, "Mrs. Crawford abandoned her legal residence, took property that didn't belong to her, and entered into a marriage of convenience with a man who lacks the physical capacity to protect or provide for a family. This is clearly not in the best interests of the child." When it was their turn to respond, Jacob and Catherine had only their own words and the testimonial letters Jacob had collected. They told their story simply and honestly, two people who'd found each other when they both needed help, who'd built something real from nothing, who'd created a family based on love rather than obligation. "Your Honor," Jacob said when given the chance to speak, "I may not be able to walk, but I can work. I can provide. I can love this child and her mother with everything I have. Thomas Crawford wants Hope because she represents property to him, the last connection to land he couldn't inherit. But to us, she represents hope for the future." The judge, an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair, listened carefully to both sides. When the arguments were finished, he asked for a short recess to consider his decision. As they waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, Jacob felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Everything they'd built together hung in the balance of one man's judgment. "Whatever happens," Catherine said quietly, "I'm glad we tried. I'm glad we chose each other." "We're not done yet," Jacob replied, but he could hear the doubt in his own voice. When they were called back into the courtroom, the judge's expression was unreadable. He looked at Thomas, then at Jacob and Catherine, and finally at baby Hope, who chose that moment to smile at him with the radiant joy that only infants could manage. "I've considered all the evidence presented," the judge said formally, "and I find that this marriage is valid under territorial law. Furthermore, I find no evidence that Mr. Reeves is unfit to serve as guardian to the child. The petition is denied." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Thomas's lawyer immediately began arguing for an appeal, while Catherine burst into tears of relief. Jacob felt like he could breathe for the first time in weeks. But as they gathered their things to leave, Thomas himself approached them, his face dark with fury. "This isn't over," he said quietly, so only they could hear. "You may have won in court, but there are other ways to get what I want. Remember that when you're lying in your beds at night." The threat sent ice through Jacob's veins, but he met Thomas's gaze steadily. "If you come after my family again, you'll find out exactly how much protection a man in a wheelchair can provide." As they left the courthouse and prepared for the journey home, Jacob realized that they'd won more than just a legal victory. They'd proven to themselves and the world that their love was real, their family was legitimate, and their partnership was strong enough to withstand whatever challenges came their way. The road back to their homestead stretched before them, leading toward a future that was uncertain but theirs to build together. And for the first time since Gettysburg, Jacob felt like that future held genuine promise. Hope slept peacefully in her mother's arms as their wagon rolled through the Kansas countryside, heading home to the life they'd chosen and fought to keep.